This is the Everyday Fray podcast, hosted by Michael Howie.
Hello, friend. I'm Michael Howie, and this is episode 3 of the Everyday Fray podcast. Grief is not something I have experienced too much of in my life, but it's not something I or anyone else can really avoid. Certainly, the dread of how I'll feel or what I'll do and how the world will look after the loss of a loved one has haunted me at 4 a.m. Fortunately, I haven't had to manage through such a loss yet. But every day, as we go on about our lives, there is someone grieving the loss of a loved one. One tragic story was that of Dr. Carrie Pact with Freeman. I've known Carrie for a few years through our mutual interest in careers in communicating about animals. She's a professor at Georgia State University, and her work on how the media sometimes fails to fairly represent animals profoundly changed my views when I worked as a journalist. In a recent email exchange, I learned of Carrie's story. She was widowed at 29 when her husband died of cancer. Following her own ups and downs with grief, Carrie took what she learned and combined it with her love of journaling and created the Widow's Journal, questions to guide you through grief and life planning after the loss of a partner. This beautiful book differs from many of the self-help books Carrie read in that it doesn't tell the reader what to do or how they should feel, but instead encourages introspection, bereavement, and looking to the future through probing questions and the act of journaling. To share her at times heartbreaking and at times inspiring journey, Carrie joined the Everyday Fray podcast for an honest, in-depth conversation about grief, journaling, and life after loss. I think the logical place to start in this is probably the most difficult part to start with, and that is your story. It kind of sets off the whole chain of events to get us to this conversation.
Right.
So, to the level with which you're comfortable, could you share that story?
Yeah. Well, I lived in Fort Myers, Florida, which is on the Gulf Coast of Florida. And I went down there. I'm from Atlanta, but I moved down there because a high school friend of mine, her mom, kind of offered me a job. So otherwise, I didn't have any ties to that area. And it's also, I was in my 20s. It was kind of a strange place to move to leave Atlanta because it's like the retirement capital of Florida. So I'm like, I'm moving to this place where people retire and I'm in my 20s. So I'm like, I'm never going to meet anybody. So it was kind of strange that I actually did meet somebody and get married down there, not in Atlanta. But because I met him and my husband Dave in this kung fu class that was in my near my house.
Were you in the Kung Fu class too?
Yes, I took a Kung Fu class because somebody had put a flyer on my car, and so I was interested in self-defense and that kind of thing. So I took the class, and yeah, so that's how I met him, and he's from South Africa originally, and so that was interesting, and So we started dating, it was probably like 1996 or something like that. But he got cancer after the first year we were dating. He had bone cancer, which is actually kind of more of a rare cancer. He had a lump in his chest and he was having trouble breathing. And he was so healthy. He was a rock climber and a windsurfer. And so it just was so strange. And so even when we took him to the emergency room, we didn't really think, that he had a tumor or something. But so he had to go through all the therapy that you go through with, especially back then, it was, I think, worse than it is now with the chemo and the radiation and the surgery. And his parents came over from South Africa to help with that process. And so they stayed and lived with him for like a year. So that was obviously a difficult time since we'd only been together for a year, to suddenly have that kind of pressure put on our relationship. But he survived that process and it was looking good. And so he was in remission. And then we got engaged and we were married for 2 years before he passed away, but we were together for 6 years total. But what happened was he got a pre-leukemia that turned into a leukemia, which I think is basically a side effect of some of the chemo that he had to get rid of the bone cancer. Because sometimes, when you're younger, they really pummel you with the chemo because they know you can take it. So, but in the process, you take a risk that, because they didn't want to give you too little chemo, and then they might not get rid of the tumor. So they give you enough, a lot, but in the process, you've really poisoned yourself. So then he ended up getting leukemia. And that really is fatal. And so the only way you can get out of that is with a stem cell transplant. And so, luckily we were approved for a stem cell transplant and you have to get a donor, and it goes through this bone marrow transplant center. And so you don't know who the donor is, but you just hope that there's somebody out there that is a match for you and that kind of thing. So luckily they did find somebody, and he was approved. And it was interesting. And so we were at the Moffitt Cancer Center, which was in Tampa, Florida. So we moved, we both kind of stopped working for a while and went on family medical leave, and we're in Tampa. And it was actually during the week of September 11th, 2001, that he had his stem cell transplant. And it was weird because his stem cells were coming on a plane from wherever they were coming from, I don't know, when all the airports were shut down because of September 11th. Although that was if you remember, it was very short-lived. Like that was an immediate response, like let's shut down all the airports. So that was kind of strange. But of course, there's all these, ours is just one example of the many medical reasons people need airplanes. There's people's organs and all kinds of things. You really can't shut down the airplane. So that was very kind of strange at the time. But anyway, so the stem cells got there, and so he had the transplant and everything. But after about 2 weeks later, he went into what is essentially a coma. It was sepsis, an infection. And that really kind of was prolonged. And then he died on September 28th. And so, that was just a very stressful, the whole experience was very stressful. And I think even though I knew there was a high mortality rate for stem cell transplants, I still had thought he would survive because, he did before and he was, otherwise healthy. But I guess I was a little more prepared than people would be, like all the people who were widowed at September 11th, by surprise and shock and violence. So it was also just a strange time, I feel like, to be widowed, because there's also this this big discussion about people being widowed at the same time, but in a very different context, a more violent context than mine. So I actually felt grateful that he was in the hospital, and he had, like, if someone is dying and they are in the hospital, or they have a serious disease and they're in the hospital, all your friends and coworkers reach out to you, and it's actually really a loving and nice thing. It's very positive. Everybody's telling you how they feel about you. So then if you do pass away, people don't feel like, there's a sense of closure. And so in that case, it was stressful, and there's no good way to lose someone, but I did feel positive about the experience. Like, I feel like we all did the best we could. And his body was just, it just didn't work out. It was too difficult. And so, so that's what happened. And so that was in 2001, and I was in South Florida. And so I had been planning on going to graduate school before this. And when he was diagnosed with leukemia, I had to just postpone all the places that accepted me for my master's program because they were out of state. And so, but this did give me something to do after I was widowed. I already had a plan that I was going to go to graduate school. So I just kind of finished out the year at my company, and my company was really great to me. And then let them know that I was wanting to go to school. And so then I kind of got a fresh start, and I left, the apartment and everything, and left Florida and moved up to Athens, Georgia, to UGA, which is also kind of near my family in Atlanta. So I thought that was a good thing to do. But it still was hard going to graduate school and having to challenge myself that way when I was in mourning and crying every day. So it was amazing that I really could do well in graduate school under those circumstances. But I also think it was good for me to have something to concentrate on and something new I was working on and being in a different place. And so I thought that was useful. And by the time I went out to University of Oregon for my PhD, that had been about, I don't know, 2.5 years after he had passed away. So I was doing a bit better by that point. And so I had a better or easier time when I was at University of Oregon finishing up my PhD. But I say now it's been over 15 years. So it's been a long time. Yeah.
You speak of this with what sounds like the maturity I know you to have from all of our other conversations, but was the way you're describing it now of the process being positive in that you had the opportunity to share feelings, to say goodbye, to have that closure. Was that something you could recognize in the moment when you were 29, sort of disconnected from family?
I think everybody would recognize that actually, because it always is just so touching. Your family reaches out to you, your coworkers, they they give you a hat and everyone signed it, or they're just doing these sentimental type things they wouldn't normally do for you. People are coming from out of town, to come and visit you in the hospital. People are doing you all kinds of favors. And so I feel like it's actually very obvious that you should be appreciative of everything. I also think the fact that I'm interested in animal rights and pay so much attention to the death of non-human animals, and I know that that's happening on an institutional level, that we're killing animals all the time. I guess my feeling of life and death is a little bit different because of that. So to me, knowing how many individuals die all the time and also in such ugly ways, to me, this was like the most a living being could expect, right? That the whole community and this hospital of people, as everyone's reaching out to you, trying to save your life. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the most you can expect. So I was fortunate. I did recognize that I was fortunate that at least I didn't have to feel bad about the process. Because other situations where somebody loses someone in a car accident or because of some violence or negligence or something, then you may feel guilty. And so at least I didn't have to deal with that whole other level mm-hmm. of anxiety or depression that you would have, regret, I should say, maybe, from not being able to tell the person what they mean to you or show them.
Yeah. Well, and that's very, I think the way you noted too, that it was at the time of September 11th. Yeah. And we've heard all of the stories that started coming out very, very quickly after that event of, people desperately trying to call loved ones.
Right.
And saying, we're not going to make it. And, it's horrifying what happened on that day. And I think that's... And
think how angry you would be.
Yeah.
I would have been so angry if somebody took him from me. You know what I mean? But nobody took him from me. It was a disease, And so, I guess I could get mad at the medical establishment, like with the chemotherapy. Why is it so toxic and stuff? And I think they've worked on that now. Like, I think there's a lot of people I notice going through cancer therapy now who don't seem to have chemo, or they have all different kinds of treatments that seem a lot less poisonous. But again, at the time, that was what the medical establishment was doing. So we were we were at Massachusetts General, which is one of the best hospitals for a lot of it. So I don't really regret, the choices we made, but I guess I could, right? But I just didn't go down that path, of saying, oh, did we do something wrong? Because it's not going to help anyway. So, but it still doesn't, you still are left, with the main thing, which is the loss, like that the person is not there anymore and you expected them to be there for the rest of your life and they're not there. So even if you can get past the way they died, then the bigger issue is dealing with the fact that they're not there anymore.
Well, and that's, as when we were emailing about this interview, and I was reading about the book we're going to talk about and everything, thinking about that, and of course with my anxiety disorder, laying in bed next to my wife at night, and just get that pit in your stomach of thinking, what if?
Yeah.
And I know someone who's going through their husband is going through a horrible bout of cancer. They're what's the right word? They're in hospice now.
Oh no.
And I just, in one regard, it's you feel horrible for them, for that loss that's coming, and also recognition of the selfishness that I keep thinking, how would I feel?
Yeah.
And sort of bringing it back to myself to try and understand.
Yeah, that's natural. Because you're empathizing.
Yeah.
You're empathizing
with
them. And you're feeling more appreciative of your marriage because none of us know how long we have with anybody, whether it's our parents or our kids or our spouse. And so, you just have to be appreciative of it, because even though you think with your spouse that you're signing up for this thing to be together for decades, and hopefully it will work out that way, and probably it will.
Yeah.
But sometimes it doesn't. I will say that, you can be a good friend to your friend who, after their spouse or husband dies, then, you and your wife can make sure that you try to spend a lot of time with her, and, don't ignore her. Because I think that can sometimes happen, is that you don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. Naturally. I think it's natural. Like when one of your friends go through something tragic and they're really sad, you feel like, oh, I don't want to bother them, or I don't know what to say, or I'm going to say the wrong thing. But I do think it's better to reach out, even if you are saying, quote unquote, the wrong thing. There's no, it's still better to put yourself out there and let her say no if she doesn't want to hang out with you or doesn't feel up to it. I think it would be a nice gesture, because you get a lot of attention when you're first widowed. It's very obvious to everybody that you're in crisis, and they reach out to you, and you're almost not even that sad at that time, because you're kind of in shock, and your life hasn't really hit you what life's going to be like, and you've got the funeral and all these people. And so it's only after all that dies down and then the sympathy cards stop coming, and then you start really feeling alone. And so I actually think your grief just gets worse at first. You're in the first year. You might feel worse after the first or second year than you did when it first happened. And then that's depressing to you, because you're hoping that you get progressively better, but it doesn't. I mean, I don't know. That was just how it worked for me. It would be different for everybody. But some of my friends made really nice efforts of coming to visit me from out of town, or, making me special CDs, or like they were really trying to do special things for me, which I really appreciated. But I think it was hard though, because I was at a point in my life where most of my friends were newly married, and they also were having kids. And so they also didn't have the time to be there for me, most of them. And so that was also difficult for me. I felt very out of sync with everyone else in my circle. It worked out for me going to graduate school, because a lot of people in graduate school, there's like kind of the social aspect to graduate school, and maybe there's a lot of people who are single, and so that's good. But of my older friends who you really want to gravitate to when you lose somebody close to you, you really want your friends and your old friends and your family. It was hard because either they didn't live near me, or they just didn't have the time because they had a young family. And so I felt, in that case, it made me feel more alone, I think.
When we talk about any kind of wellness, whether it's managing grief in this kind of situation, or managing depression or anxiety in another, there's no hard and fast rules necessarily in how you should or shouldn't feel.
Right.
And I think that's probably something that, for me, when I was learning about my anxiety, it was very difficult to sort of grasp, is that, while there are sort of boundaries, there's no, this is what it is all the time. and what you can expect. And I'm curious, is that something that, as you were sort of learning to live after this event, you hear about, the stages of grief and this and that. Is that something that was helpful for you to be able to look at, or is it something that didn't really apply?
Well, I definitely really gravitated to grief books. Not everybody does that, but maybe, and I wasn't an academic yet, although I guess I was getting into academia, but that was just my natural thing to do. In addition to going to the hospice groups, that hospice, puts on a lot of grief therapy groups. And so, I was doing all the things you're supposed to do. I had like a personal counselor. I would go to group counseling. I would try to go on walks, and I was reading all these grief books. So, yeah, so it is useful, I guess, to kind of know or to read stories about how other people have coped, or that this happens to other people who are young, or, those kinds of things. But it's still, in a way, it doesn't, make you, it doesn't totally lessen your pain just to know that other people have had these bad things happen, or, and yeah, you might not follow, even though I wrote the Widow's Journal, a grief book, I can't even exactly tell you what the stages of grief are, because, I don't know that people go through them in some orderly fashion anyway. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things with this Widow's Journal that I wrote is it's more of a series of questions, and there might be some intonation in the question about, like, if I'm asking you when do you feel better? How should you take care of yourself? There's the insinuation you should be taking care of yourself, and you should be trying to be less sad. But I also don't know that I have the answer. Yeah. I can't really tell people how that's going to be, or that they're going to feel better after 1 year versus 2 years. And I actually, after 2 years, I was still crying every day. And I just felt like after a couple of years, that was maybe too much. And I had refused any kind of antidepressants or any kind of drugs that people do offer you when it first happens. Everyone, is like, oh, do you need, some medication? And at first I thought, well, no, I'm supposed to be sad, so I don't want any medication. But after a couple of years, I thought, I just don't know that I am coping that well if I'm crying every day, even though I'm getting straight A's, in my school and everything. And I'm socializing with people and that kind of thing. I still felt like it was my thoughts were unproductive and stuff. So I did get on antidepressants, and they did work pretty well for me. And so I was actually kind of relieved. But I don't know that I should have gone on them earlier or something. For me, it made sense. Like, I thought I would just naturally get better. And because I wasn't, it's hard to say, had I not gone on the antidepressants, would I have naturally gotten better and stopped crying every day after a few more years? I don't know. But sometimes you can get yourself so out of sync, like it's like, neuroplasticity, and they talk about those kind of things, like your body gets used to doing something. So you start to worry that you're making a habit of feeling bad. So I do talk about in the book, my Widow's Journal book, the idea that you want to get yourself in a place where you can start practicing feeling better, or creating some affirmations of things you'll keep repeating to yourself, so that you don't have unproductive or negative thoughts all the time, and you're replacing them with something more positive. But yeah, I don't know how long that might take before it actually makes a difference.
Well, and that's something I'm learning as I've delved into this project, and as I'm sharing more stories, learning more about my own, the concept that change takes work. Yeah. Change takes time, and there's no schedule.
Right.
You can set your goals, but you can't force it. You do just have to keep working at it day after day. And I think maybe that's where we start talking about this Widow's Journal book of yours. At what point in this process did you mentioned that you are a journaler?
Yeah.
So at what point did you sort of take the journaling you were likely doing and the experience you had and all you were learning about grief and the grieving process, and decide to compile it into this tool for people who were in a situation similar to yours?
Yeah, I mean, you'd think I would have done it, 3 years later or something like that, like immediately after. And so it is kind of strange that I waited like more than a decade to do it. And I'm not sure why, although a part of it is I now have gotten through graduate school and have tenure. And so maybe part of it is that I finally have the time, but it was something that I was interested in doing and never felt I could do. And I also, I'm less emotionally fragile, and so because I am getting kind of sucked back into the widow world, and I'm like, since I'm marketing the book, I'm like reaching out to widows groups and starting to talk to widows. And so I actually appreciate that it's the grieving process for me, that it's like 16 years later for me, because if it was 3 years later, I feel like I might just be, crying all the time or too tender. So in a way it kind of worked for me, but I do remember coming up with questions and because I had worked at the time also in training, and I, as a teacher, I think I like that idea of having writing assignments, and then I like, facilitating discussions through questions, which is what you do as an interviewer as well. So I think I was naturally probably doing that in my own journal, which was just a blank journal, is just trying to kind of figure these things out. Like, are the best, questions like, are the best years behind me? What if they are? That's not an easy thing to admit. What if that's true? Or what makes my life meaningful? Or do I wish this had never happened? Do I wish I had never met him? Which is kind of a hard question to ask. So I started being also kind of irreverent in my questions too, because that's one of the luxuries, I think, of writing in your journal is, even if you said something that other people would think, oh, you shouldn't say that. No, no one's judging you because this is your book. So even if you want to say something negative about your loved one who passed, like some things that are easier for you now than they were back when you were together, like you have the luxury of doing that in your journal because no one else is reading it. So there's some benefits to that. And actually my uncle passed away in 2012. And I remember that's when I think I got a little bit more serious. And I did a handwritten version of the widow's journal for my aunt who was widowed. And so I wrote out questions in a blank journal for her. And that was kind of the start of me pulling it together in a more serious way. But then I was trying to get it published, which is a whole other, I hadn't had experience outside of academia with book publishing. So, which is hard to do if you don't have a literary agent and all that stuff. And then it's hard to get an agent. So I ended up actually just self-publishing. So I had to learn about that. And then do the design myself. I worked with a graphic designer who was a student at the school where I teach. And because I wanted, the book to look very nice. Because I think that as someone who journals, I always enjoy like finding a really cool journal with a neat cover, or like pages that have just a nice design on them. Because the whole point of journaling is that it's bringing out your creative side, or you're feeling comforted or inspired. And so I do think for me, the book itself had to look and feel good. And it's also weird in a way to think, oh, you're creating a book in this age when everybody's reading things electronically. So, and even though there is an e-version of this book, but I actually don't really recommend it, because I think you really need to write something with your hand with a pen, like and that's part of the intimacy, I think, of it, right? Is this you by yourself? I always journal, maybe a lot of people do, like before you go to bed, like, because that's kind of sometimes it's the only quiet time anybody ever has, is before you go to bed. So that's when I was, as lifelong journaler, that's what I would do if I'm feeling up to it, is write in it. So yeah, I kind of pictured people, opening up this book and just kind of leafing through it and writing in it anytime they felt like it, but probably when they were kind of by themselves in kind of a quiet room, with like just a dim light, writing in it. And so hopefully I thought it would be like this comforting space for recovery. That's what I was hoping.
Well, and so I'm curious, when I was talking with Kate about this, we were wondering, your journey has been as a very young widow. And,
Right.
in the title of the book, the subtitle, it's Questions to Guide You Through Grief and Life Planning After the Loss of a Partner. So at
Yeah.
29, you had a whole lot of living left to do.
Right.
You know what I mean? But you're talking about your aunts and
Yes.
uncle, and I was wondering for seniors,
Yeah.
which in some ways I would imagine is significantly different in that you have spent potentially the majority of
Yes.
your life with this person, but you only have a bit of time left. Or like your whole
Right.
life has been built with this person, and now what? Whereas as a young widow, it's I would imagine there's I'm guessing.
Yeah, you feel like it's stolen from you. Like you were gonna have all this and you were gonna be able to retire with someone and grow old with them, and that got taken away. It's kind of how
Yeah,
it feels
and
like. Yeah, and so I have to say I can't really relate with how most people are widowed, which is like my grandparents and other people, my aunts, that where you have a long life together, but one of you dies first, and then the other person may live another 5 or 10 years. So that, and to me, it's kind of almost more tragic, even though they got the benefit of having their life together. But it seems like the loss would be even more profound than my loss. So yeah, but I also didn't want to make my book so limited, and I didn't want to prejudge how anybody would exactly feel. But yeah, I guess if you're 90 years old, this is probably not the book for you. But if you're in your 60s, and I'm only in my 40s, so I don't really know. But I do think that age is very relative to someone's health and outlook. So some people may see themselves even at 80. Let's say if they're widowed or widower at 80, they might still see like, oh, okay, I need to plan new things for myself. Another person might say, oh, well, this is just the best years of my life are behind me, and so I'm just going to die alone. I mean, I don't know how somebody is going to, react. But I do think the book probably works better for people from their 20s to their 60s, because there is this feeling of like these questions of what are you going to do in 5 years or 10 years, or you have a new phase of your life. And so, but I didn't want to limit it to say you had to be a young widow in order to utilize the book. Because plenty of people also get remarried, even in assisted living facilities or nursing homes, so they do manage to create a new life for themselves.
what I appreciate too, and what you're saying, I think we've all met someone or have someone in our family who is widowed, typically at the older age, and become very despondent or sort of ready to give up almost. And, I think of my grandmother, she lost her husband. She's 90 something now, and, she's not doing great anymore, but she had probably 10 years after my grandfather died, and they were always very independent and very active people. And she, from my perspective, sort of did almost what I hear from you, is made the choice that I'm going to keep going. This is not the end of the story.
Right. I'm not just going to wait until I die too or something.
And I think, that's a very good insight that you are sort of offering through your story and through the book, is that it's a choice that you kind of have to make.
Yeah, because it almost seems too sad. I can't even articulate what's the opposite, is just waiting to die or something. But I have to say, I mean, I kind of had no choice because I was young, right? Like, I can't just be somebody who pines away for someone else. Like, I always thought, actually, oh, I'll get remarried, and I still think that, even though I'm not remarried, but I still think that. So because of my age, it was kind of obvious that I should move on, and I already had plans to go to graduate school. But I can't say if I would be as resilient if this had happened to me when I was 85. I might just be like, I don't want this book telling me I should be like having a new phase of my life. Who knows how I would be. But it gives you the choice about how you want to cope with a loss in your life. But I feel like for me, it almost seems like you have to do something, or else because either way, even if you're having seeing as a new phase in your life or not, you're still going to be overcome with grief, and there's a feeling when you feel that bad and it actually hurts, you want to escape it. And so that's the hard part. And so that's why journaling to me was one way to escape something, even though it didn't, not that it exactly solves your problems, but you feel like you have to do something. Because if you feel so bad, you just can't sit around feeling in pain. Like I would have to try to go to the beach because when I lived in Florida, to try to make myself feel a little bit better because it was beautiful there. Or, I would go on a walk because of, the endorphins, or just, trying to stimulate myself by exercising. Or I definitely would, like eat chocolate and you just eat. Or you would take a bath, or you would somehow do something to try to make yourself feel better. And journaling is one of the things, which is like you're thinking about things, you're provoking ideas, you're writing, and whether you want to write in a sad way or whether you want to write in a hopeful way, or whether you want to plan, or just you want to observe when you feel better so that you can kind of start working on that. So like for me also, I was kind of fortunate in the sense that if I was really sad at the end of the day, if I just would go to bed and go to sleep, I would actually feel a little better in the morning.
Yeah.
And it might be the opposite for some people, but like some people might wake up totally despondent, but for me, I guess I got progressively worse. So sometimes I would just have to go to bed early because I was like, there's not, it's not going to get any better tonight, So again, it's hard to say how people.
Well, I like when you're talking about the act of writing too. Obviously I, by training, I'm a writer myself. And I've started a CBT program. It's my first one. And they're very insistent on writing our notes and writing out in our exercise books, everything. And I was kind of curious about that. Why are we writing it? We're in a group setting. Why aren't we just talking? Or why don't I go home and type it out? And I don't know necessarily why they did that, but it triggered for me the memory of being a news reporter and writing down 2 words from a sentence that someone said. And 2 days later, going back to the notebook and looking at those 2 words and remembering the phrase exactly.
Oh.
And it's sort of, in my experience, that's the power of writing physically is I can make notes like that. Like if I were typing out notes for our conversation right now, they'd just be words on the screen. But if I do that for some reason, when I do it by hand, it triggers the memory of what I was thinking or doing at the time. So, that could be sort of one of the benefits to a tool like that. Now,
plus you've got that permanence that you don't have from a discussion. And so you can go back, like in the book I was saying, it might be good to actually write a date. I always, on my journals, write the date at the top and then I do the writing. Because then when you go back, it's interesting to say, well, that's how I felt 1 year ago. Mm-hmm. And I really feel differently now, or I was in really bad shape then. So it's actually kind of interesting to see how you might answer the same question, 6 months later or something.
Definitely.
And so I do think having it written is a good way for you to review even your own progress. Or even if you think you're getting worse, you're like, well, I was more hopeful then, now I'm more despondent or something. It's also more private, of course, than the discussion, right? Mm-hmm. And so, because you're writing to yourself, you're not writing to anyone else. So I always think I'm writing to figure something out. So I'm not really writing it just to record something. My journals are not really meant, like the ones I keep throughout my life, are not meant to eventually become some book of all the boring things I did. It's more about me working through something that's bothering me. Like if you're dating and something's bothering you, or you're sad, or you're anxious, or things are going on at work, or you're insecure, or you're really happy about something, like those are it's like when you're feeling emotions in a strong way is when I tend to want to write. If things are actually, it was interesting because when I was married and things were going well and he wasn't sick or anything, I didn't write in my journal as much because I also was things were kind of good, and so I almost didn't really have, it's more when I'm struggling or wrestling with something or there's a lot of change that I tend to like writing. And so I definitely have times in my life where I write more. Yeah. And so, so it might just be useful for anybody listening to this just to get themselves a blank journal book that one that they like the look of and the feel of, and just see, even if they don't have a habit of doing that, of writing, just see how writing is like a conversation with yourself, right? And you're just trying to figure something out. And what's cool is you're not boring anyone else because, while your friends do want to talk to you about your problems, they don't want to talk to you that much about your problems. But you can talk to yourself endlessly about your problems. You can obsess about your problems if you want, and no, it's not embarrassing, right? Or you're not boring anybody. You don't feel guilty. You're not apologizing. So there's also just I think a lot of benefits to writing in a private way.
Well, I would really like you to write a book about journaling, because I can tell you my experience, I am terrible because my entire writing life has been for other people.
Oh.
Everything I've ever written is meant to be public, right? From when I started writing it, I started writing music originally when I was a teenager. That led into sort of the reporting, and then hard news, and then blogging and podcasting and all of these things. It's always outward. And when I sit down to try and write for me, I honestly, I have a huge struggle with it, even in creative writing, because I'm thinking, how does this come across constantly?
Yeah.
So that might be part of the anxiety, but I think that's probably more just a lack of practice on it.
There is always a fear that someone will read your journal and it wasn't meant. So I do think, as much as I talked about being candid, there's probably a little bit of yourself you hold back, because somebody obviously could get a hold of this physical book and read it, and it might embarrass you or something like that. But most of the time that's not going to happen, or you could, if you wanted to, you could burn it or something. You can get rid of it if you want. But I just see it as working. Either sometimes I'm entertaining myself or I'm working through things. I think because I'm a very analytical person, I like to ask myself questions. So I see it also as like journaling. It can be like a workbook where you're kind of trying to say, why am I upset? Because sometimes how you think you're upset about one thing, but it's actually something else, like it's jealousy or, and you hadn't really figured it out.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's through writing that you figure it out. But again, nobody needs to see all that work you did to figure out what's bothering you, so you've come to some conclusion. And honestly, then if you wanted to, you could destroy those pages because you've done the work already and it served its purpose. So there's a utility to it. A lot of times I'm also entertained by what I write because I think it's funny or something. Maybe not in the widow's journal, but not so much. But in other times, I'll read something back and I'll just think it's pretty funny, or I'll comment back to myself on a previous page, or something. So it's like it is like a continuing conversation with yourself. And if you like yourself, then I think you'll enjoy writing for yourself.
Yeah.
So I think you would enjoy it, Michael.
All right. Maybe I will pick up a notebook and give it a try again. Now, in your materials, your marketing materials, you make it very clear that the Widow's Journal, and I'll read directly from the site, doesn't tell you what to do. It isn't a memoir or collection of other people's stories, and it isn't limited to any particular spiritual outlook. And that is very true in a lot of self-help type books. I would say sort of the genre itself.
Yes.
And in the way you've written this, it seems to me that was important to you, that the Widow's Journal wouldn't be these things. Why was it important to you to avoid many of those, tropes or stereotypes, and to instead have this journaling exercise book?
Yeah, well, I mean, for one thing, I think there's enough books out there of people telling their own story. So it's not like anyone really, I mean, there's a little bit of my story in the book, but like nobody really needed a book to hear my particular story. So that's one thing. But what I didn't see in the market was something similar to this. Although I will say that if you lose a pet or companion animal, there are quite a few journals. So I was thinking, maybe I could write a journal for people who have lost a companion animal. But actually, I feel like they already have them out there, so they don't need one. So I don't need to write one. But so partly was I didn't really see something like this. And so that's one of the reasons that I did it. And I'm not an expert, so I can't I have a PhD, but it's not a PhD in psychology. It's in communication. So I'm not a grief expert. I'm just somebody who is widowed. So that's why I'm just asking you questions that you answer. But I think I'm doing it in a thoughtful enough way that I'm trying to make sure that you are seeking, that you're having, your thoughts are productive, or that you're wanting to survive, and that you're reaching out to others, and that you're not doing anything self-destructive. So I wanted to take enough care to, show that people, I don't think anything goes in the book. I don't want someone to be suicidal or something like that. And then the thing about the spiritual outlook is, first, we live in a diverse world where lots of people, there's various religions that people have, but not everybody is religious. And increasingly, the world is becoming less religious, right? More people are agnostic or atheist. And so, but if you read a lot of self-help books, especially the grief books, they talk a lot about angels and heaven and different things, which is also particularly Christian outlook. And if you're not Christian or you're not religious, those things are not comforting to you, and they can actually feel alienating. Mm-hmm. So I didn't write this book I wanted it to be, if you were Christian or Jewish or Muslim, I hope that you could use this book, because occasionally I'll mention someone's faith, or is there a spiritual belief that is comforting to you? So there's opportunities to bring your faith in if you want, but I have never put stuff about heaven and angels and things like that in the book, because I just thought there was a lot of that out there already. It's actually really, at least in the United States, in the grief books, they are mostly Christian. And so, and for some people, if you do believe in an afterlife, that may be very comforting. But I'm not somebody who does believe in that. So it seemed like a cop out to me to just have cards or different books kind of talking about when you see your spouse again in heaven. I don't, for me personally, that wasn't comforting. So I didn't really want to put that on anybody. So people can build their own beliefs into the book as they want to. So, and I also wrote it in a way that was gender neutral, because it would be easier for me about the whole thing to just keep talking about him, like your husband that you lost. But I wanted to make it so that, men could feel they could use the book too, or I'm not assuming that the person that you lost was of the opposite sex either. Mm-hmm. So I tried to use the term your loved one instead of saying him or her. So I try to avoid gender in the book, just to also kind of offer it up to a wider audience. Even though I do think a lot of people who will gravitate towards writing are women, I do think it is something that a lot of women might be more apt to do.
There's an argument to say that is a traditional gender role, yes. And it's something that society has certainly suggested women are more comfortable doing.
Communicating, expressing, coping, trying to nurture themselves. But one thing I think might appeal to men, I don't know exactly, but just the idea of the privacy of it. Because although I think more men should do like what you're doing with this podcast, is like, we should all talk about mental health. We should all talk about needing a therapist and going to therapy and improving ourselves. But it does seem like a lot of men have not been encouraged to express vulnerability. So I do think that some men might appreciate the privacy of a journal to express their vulnerability just to themselves. But I don't think it should end there. I think they should also reach out to their friends, and they should cry in front of other people, and they should have a therapist and not be apologetic about it.
Yeah, that's a whole different conversation.
Yeah, it is.
But it is something I appreciate from you, and I certainly have experienced difficulty with over the years. Yeah. Now, I have two questions I want to end on. The first one is specific to your mentioning of the use of antidepressants. And this is... I think when we talk about stigma, something that gets maybe not talked about enough in terms of stigma. There's a lot of people who talk about stigma in terms of simply opening up about mental health or opening up about emotions and having stigma surrounding that. But I personally think stigma around medication is something that needs to be talked about. For me, I've discussed I was very resistant to taking anxiety or depression medication. And then when I did, amazingly, I got better. And there's a lot of people who say, I don't need it. I don't want it. And they become very almost defensive of the idea that I'm strong enough to do this on my own. What was the line for you to sort of say, I need the help?
I feel like I was having, I don't want to say suicidal thoughts because I don't want to say I wasn't going to kill myself. I'm being really blunt here, but I'm just saying I call it unproductive thoughts, like thoughts that more like, oh, I'm so sad, like that I didn't care if I did die. And so that to me and after a couple years of being widowed, I felt like that's not where I should be. Right.
Yeah.
So I was just being more protective of myself. Like, these thoughts are not productive. And I'm trying to do everything with therapy and the writing in my journal. And, I'm self-actualizing. I'm in graduate school. I go on walks. I have a cat. Like, I have a nice family. Like, I'm doing all the things and I'm still not feeling better. So I felt like it was doing myself a disservice to take medication off the table, right? Like, why would I not consider it? And actually, it really helped. And so I was happy that I did it, and I did. But I don't think everyone needs to do that initially. I think you have to see if you think you are trying as much as you can on your own. And I didn't really think of it as a failure. I actually thought of it also as your brain chemistry, right? Like, maybe your brain chemistry just kind of gets used to being sad, and you just kind of can't, no matter what you do, you can't get past it. And so maybe you need some medication, to help with that. And so I kind of also just looked at it that way.
Well, I think it's just sort of like talking about having, taking antibiotics. I avoid antibiotics when I can, personally. And this should be prefaced with, I have chronic sinus infections, or I had chronic sinus infections.
Yeah.
So I would avoid antibiotics and the reasoning would be that I want them to work more effectively when I really need them. But the point is, you try and beat it on your own, and if you can't, you take the antibiotics.
Right.
Like it becomes a very simple decision. But when we talk about mental health, we very rarely sort of acknowledge medication as a tool, whether it is temporary or long term.
Yes.
So
and it's also one thing you still have to keep working on.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not, right. We all know that, right? It's like the medication helps with the other things, or it can take some of the edge off or something. Or it's one thing that you do. But I think it can be frustrating, though, if you know somebody who's also extremely or like chronically depressed or bipolar or something like that, and you want to keep helping them and you want to keep helping them as their friend, but they won't take medication, because then it's like you're at a loss, over the years of how to help them. You could either be talking about yourself or about a friend that you know. And so at some point it seems like it doesn't make sense for people to resist medication if they're so bad.
Yeah.
You're like, what side effects could you have from medication that would be worse than being miserable every day?
Yeah.
So, but if you do try the medication and it's an experiment, it always is an experiment. And if it's not working for you, you really don't like the side effects, then switch medications, experiment with something else, or eventually, get off of it and say, well, I tried that and I didn't like it. But then at least you'll know.
Yes.
I think some people might be afraid to try it because it's also like a last resort, kind of like what you were saying.
Yeah.
So what if, they almost might take comfort in the fact that, like, oh, well, I still haven't hit rock bottom yet. So, but if I take the antidepressants and they don't work, then I'm really going to be scared, So some people might be they might not even be conscious of that reason, because I would have been very scared if I had started taking antidepressants and they had no effect. And then I thought, oh my God, it made me crying every day the rest of my life. This is terrible. So I lucked out, and actually the first thing I tried worked very well. And so, and it doesn't really have side effects that are much at all. So, it kind of ended up being positive. But I definitely don't push medication on anybody. It's always, their choice. But I did admit in the front of the book that I took antidepressants, because I remember my mom was like, do you want to put that in the, do you want to kind of put that out there? So, but I mean, I'll mention it in front of my students. So I try not to be embarrassed about it because I want my students also in my other part of my life as an academic, I want them to kind of feel like who knows what they're going through, right?
Yeah.
And so I also want to model, here I am, a somewhat successful person who is willing to admit that I have vulnerabilities or that I need help or that I, have sought therapy and so because I want the students to feel like that's something that could be normal for them or okay for them, or they don't have to be uncomfortable about it. So I noticed that some of my students will talk to me about that or admit that to me, or if they're the first person that admits it, then I'll admit it to them to make them feel maybe more comfortable, that, oh yeah, this is normal, a lot of people take this medication, and so I just want it to be more of an open conversation, so to get rid of the stigma, like what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's we also have to, of course, note that any medication should be taken under the advisement of a physician and with their discretion.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and it's very much what you do. I think is very noble in saying that, I am a person who is respected, successful, and I once needed help, and it's okay to ask for help. And it's normal. It's not normalizing necessarily medication, but normalizing that everybody needs a hand up from time to time. Yeah. And to wrap up, that's kind of where I wanted to touch on is you are now you're a successful academic. You've published some significant papers, one of which I cite actually this week in Defender Radio, my other podcast, again, as one of the most influential documents I've ever read in my career.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
And you have a radio show. You've got a full life. Looking back and looking forward, how do you feel? I mean, you said it's been 16 years since this life-altering moment, or life-altering journey, I should say. And you've come all this way. How do you, at a just sort of broad spectrum, how do you feel? How do you feel about everything that's happened and everything that might still happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I am pretty proud of a lot of the things, that I've accomplished. And I think I often feel somewhat content and appreciative. But I also know I'm not as happy as I could be. And I also feel overworked and, anxious about things. So I'm not like this, perfectly content person, but I'm not depressed. And that's important to me, mm-hmm. like to get past that and to constantly kind of be working on myself. So I'm always thinking about like new challenges or how to make my life even more meaningful, or am I enjoying what I'm doing? Like I always have those kind of personal growth questions. And I haven't remarried. And so I still kind of see that as potentially on the horizon. That would make it even more like probably considered a success. Like, oh, well, she was widowed young and then now, oh, she's happily remarried. So it is, maybe it doesn't seem quite as happy, like, oh, she never remarried. But, I still think that might happen. I might be in my 70s when that happens. I don't know, when it's going to happen. But I'm still open to that because I do think it rounds out your life more, to have have a successful relationship. And so, but I'm also, there's a lot of things I enjoy about being single/independent. And so I just also try to maximize that, because whether you're married or married with kids or whether you're single, there's always a benefit to any of those roles, mm-hmm. And there's a pro and there's pros and cons, right? So I think some of the people who are married with kids, who have like that's very fulfilling to them, also look at my life, and I get to travel a lot as an academic. And that's one of the benefits that I have, because I don't have kids and, like I don't have much in terms of my family life, immediate family life. So I have more opportunities that way. And so, yeah, maybe if I had kids, I'd have to give some, up the travel and stuff like that. And so it would be a trade-off, and that would be okay. Right. So I guess I also just try to have people maximize their appreciation for what their situation is, because there is no perfect situation where you can have everything,
I think it's about being happy more times than not. Yeah.
Right. It's not like you can have everything and things can be perfect. Right. It's about appreciating what you have, or at least when you're having a really good day or something. Yeah, just trying to enjoy things as much as you can, you know? So, but yeah, it's also difficult for me as well because I do take, as an academic and someone who's an activist, I do take on the world's problems. And I was just speaking with another activist friend of mine, and we were like, we'd probably be a lot happier if we weren't so concerned about changing the world.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it also makes our lives meaningful, the fact that we're trying to change the world, and get people to be more compassionate towards animals and the environment and social justice. So it's like those things are stressful to me, but they're also pleasurable at the same time. They're meaningful. So it's a kind of a double-edged sword. But yeah, if I was more ignorant to the world's problems or only focused on myself, I might be happier than I am. But maybe I wouldn't feel like I was living as meaningful a life. So
you're working on it. It's the short answer.
Yeah. I would like to be ignorant of the world's problems and not care about them at some point, but that hasn't happened. And so yet I still keep trying to change everything, which, so that means you're constantly, unsatisfied, right? Like if you're an activist, you're unsatisfied, you're constantly trying to make things better. So I suppose then you just have to be happy when you see small victories or when you meet other people who also have a compassionate outlook about the world. And so then it kind of restores your faith in humanity, to meet more people along the way, trying to help others out, whether they're human or non-human animals. And I made that actually kind of part of the book in terms of making your life meaningful is probably not only taking care of yourself, but taking care of others is part of making your life meaningful. So who are those others for you? Is it your family, or is it, animals? Is it people who are homeless? I mean, there's a lot of ways that we can take care of other people and in the process make ourselves happier, I think.
So is there a happy life after the loss of a partner?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's easier for me to say, again, like we talked about, because I'm not 90 years old. And because then I might have a different experience. But because I always knew that I had supposedly many decades left of my life, that there wasn't a choice to give up. And so I worked on my career, and now I live closer to my parents and my brother. I definitely think there is. Because I don't think you should also let a loss define your life. Like it can't be all about what you don't have. Another way to look at it is that you never knew how long it might have been fated or something, if you believe in fate or destiny, that person was not going to live a long life and neither of you knew it. So you could also look at it that way, like, oh, you got to spend time with that person while they were alive. They were never going to live as long as you were going to live. But now, and so your life continues and you can have more positive experiences and you could try to be grateful for the time that you did get to spend with that person instead of just seeing it as a loss that they're not here now.
I encourage anyone who may be experiencing grief or a loss to order a copy of The Widow's Journal from thewidowsjournal.com. I'm looking forward to taking up Carrie's challenge of journaling. I'll be visiting the bookstore this weekend to pick up a blank book. And I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you on everydayforapodcast.com, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook about this episode, your own journey, and what you love about journaling. I'm Michael Howie for the Everyday for A podcast, and my journey is far from over.